What are the ramifications of New York mayoral candidate Zohran Mamdani's socialist positions? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to this week's Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you all the principled case for the free society and the libertarian philosophy. I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
It's good to see you and to be with our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, thank you all for tuning in. And again, thank you for your great support of our work. So, Richard, the conservatives and the Republicans are up in arms in New York City. Well, really around the country over what's happening in New York City, and that is that this self-labeled, self-described socialist named Zohran Mamdani has just been nominated, I guess on the Democratic ticket. I'm not really sure how it works there, but he received the nomination to be the mayor. He still has opposition in the fall from the current mayor who's running on some other kind of ticket. Again, I don't understand how the New York City system works, but um, the likelihood is that Mamdani is going to win. That's at least what everybody's saying. The millionaires in New York City are now putting their money behind who's the current mayor?
Adams.
Adams. Uh, so I thought we ought to discuss, some of his positions because, he has thrown the right wing into a real tizzy here, and from a libertarian standpoint, rightly so. But I thought it would be helpful to examine exactly what he stands for in terms of what socialism is. It used to be a horrible thing. I mean, during the Cold War, they were looking for communists. And it seems to me there's not a whole lot of difference between a socialist and a communist. I'm not really sure what the difference is, but I thought, well, let's take a look at his positions and see, what really is wrong with them. For example, let's start with one. He wants to establish government-owned grocery stores. So his argument is that, look, there's a lot of poverty in New York. The city is very difficult to live in, especially for poor people. The prices are soaring. He calls it the affordability position, that it's just almost impossible to afford to live in New York City. So he's saying that to help the poor, what we ought to do is establish government-owned grocery stores that don't operate at a profit, that help the poor by essentially giving them food at cost. And the city would own these things, and they would be put in the poorest parts of the city. And in this way, the poor would be benefited. So it's classic socialist position. It's not calling for a total nationalization of all the means of production and so forth, but it's what we would call a socialist measure, a socialist project, a socialist program. And on first blush, it would seem very attractive to people. My gosh, government-run grocery store. Who can argue with that? Selling things at cost. You see this phenomenon, especially like in Latin American countries that have nationalized like their oil industry. And they say, well, the oil industry, it belongs to the nation, it belongs to society. Why should a few oil companies own natural resource like oil? And I think the argument is the same on government-run grocery stores. That, hey, why shouldn't the government own and operate grocery stores? What's the harm in it? Might even provide competition for the for-profit grocery stores, make them more efficient. What's wrong with competition? So, how do you respond to this, Richard, as an Austrian economist?
Well, I think there's several perspectives. Let me sort of go through a few of them. One is where does the money come from for the stores to be operated and to be selling the produce and other items um, at below market prices? It means that other segments of the New York City population will have to be taxed. So we're really talking about is a subsidization of some in the society by taxing the wealth of others, taking from Peter to give to a variety of Pauls. So this is just a wealth distribution. Now, we are in a relatively still mobile society with other places in which people can live. So what happens if taxes are raised at the city level sufficiently that you start having even more of an outflow of New York residents to other places where taxes are lower? The tax base will be reduced, which means that the expenses of running the city as a whole will then involve even more trade-offs than the very inefficient city government faces now. If you're going to have the money to spend on these free food stores, while your tax base is slowly eroding away, as people even just move to New Jersey and avoid some of these taxes, or establish their corporate or business headquarters in other states, like many companies have been moving from high tax states to Texas, you then end up in trade-offs. Well, from even from his own point of view, well, are we going to keep pouring money into these cost or quote free food stores, or are we going to cut back on other government services that for the poor? You can't avoid the trade-offs. There's the other fact is that how does the store know how to operate? Where's the cost factors? Do we carry more fruits? Do we carry more vegetables? Do we carry more meats, potatoes, loaves of bread, milk, and butter? The market solves this thing by being guided by the price mechanism. If people are demanding more bread and less canned corn, that represents in the greater demand bringing about higher prices for one and lower prices for the other. And that influences the supermarket or the grocery store managers and owners in deciding how much to buy from wholesalers to match and reflect the consumer demand. Now, what will happen in these stores? It has to be the government, since it's not a price mechanism, in deciding what will be carried and in what quantities and of what types and what qualities, because they decide what these people really need. Now, the other thing is that if you're going to charge for food below market levels, and that's what he's talking about, okay, it's going to have to be rationed. Unless you're going to establish some type of income identity card system, how do you prevent middle class people or even, quote, wealthy people from getting into their cars or taking a taxi and driving to the part of towns where these stores are and also wanting to buy this below cost food, below market price food? So then the government is going to have a rationing system. And on what basis do they ration it? And how do they decide who's eligible and who's not? The conundrums of the rationality of how the stores will be run, the determining the products to be carried because there's no profit and price mechanism, the need that there'll be greater demand than available supplies at these free or supposed cost level pricings. How do you then ration these things? All of the irrationalities that we see in historically in socialist countries where these industries or services have been nationalized will rise to the surface again. Let me just mention, uh, if I can take a minute here or two. I saw this system at work in the former Soviet Union. I was traveling there frequently in its last years, and even in their showcase city, the capital, Moscow, everything was government run. And what you do is you go into the government run dairy stores, the government run bread stores, the government run meat stores. And the price system wasn't allocating it. Prices were arbitrarily set for these at very low non-market or hypothetical market levels. And so how did the government do this? You went through a rationing system. You waited on a line. And at the end of the line, you had someone who said, what do you want to buy? If you were in a bread store, you'd say, oh, assuming they even had some, one rye, one pumpernickel. Then they'd give you a receipt. And you'd have to go to another line and wait on that line to then pay for the bread items you wanted. And then they would give you a receipt having paid. And then you would go back to a third line and then wait on that line to finally collect what you had purchased. Your day was wasted for the fact that the government imposed these time costs on you. Unbelievable time costs because everything was irrational since there was no price mechanism to tell what people wanted and for it to be allocated. Now, this thinking is exactly the one that we had Bernie Sanders when he was running for president. He would say that he thought that the government-run food stores in the Soviet Union were good. It is good, as he said, it is good. And then rich people can't buy all the food. Some goes for poor people. Yeah, what? First of all, what kind of la la land that he lives in? Oh, yeah, Bill Gates buys all the food in America, and there's nothing left for the rest of us. I mean, this thinking is totally irrational. So one form of government planning and regulation, government food stores with these artificial, non-market, below market prices will then cause the need for identification, for rationing, and the determination of who's eligible and on what basis and how much. I mean, then you have to have not who's coming in, but how much bread can they buy? How much milk can they buy? Now the government is deciding digestive and family needs. Well, what if you have a large family of 7 kids versus a family with 2 kids? Now the government has to be intruding into a demographics of family size to determine the rationing portions. And by the way, if that sounds crazy, that's what was done during the Second World War here in the United States because they had price controls on government production direction for war purposes. So everybody had ration coupons, ration tickets. How many pounds of meat or ounces of meat could your family have each week? How many loaves of bread? How much cheese? How many cans of corn? Based upon the government's allocational decision, arbitrary. Well, there's 4 members of this family. There's 6 members of that family. Oh, this fellow works in a war-related industry and he does hard work. He needs more meat. Oh, this person still does something in the civilian sector, even though it's wartime. His family needs less meat. That's what went on in this country in World War II. We don't know that because it all went down the historical or Orwellian memory hole. But that would be the type of thing that inevitably would have to be imposed upon the citizenry of the state of the city of New York. Now, people don't think about, oh, we'll just go and we'll get what we want and it'll be cheap. No, that's not how the real world works. Or as Thomas Sowell, the free market economist, often says, when you look at a government intervention and they say, well, this is what we're going to do and this is the policy we're going to implement, he says, and then what happens? In other words, what's the second step and the third step in the causal links of all the consequences of any form of government intervention?
Yeah, well, you've raised a lot of great points, especially the economic points. It's just, and bringing up the Soviet Union is great. I traveled to Cuba many years ago and saw the same phenomenon there. And I just find it fascinating, Richard, that so many people are still seduced by the siren song of socialism. Um, I mean, why stop at grocery stores? What about pharmacies? Why not have government run pharmacies? Why not have government run restaurants? What's wrong with a government owned restaurant that would sell at cost? The poor would now have restaurants to go to. Well, that is what happened in Cuba. The government ended up running everything. And as you point out, that ultimately everybody gets impoverished because you got to tax people to fund these things. And the more you take from the wealthy, they start dropping into the middle class. And then the middle class starts becoming poor. So what ends up happening is everybody's poor. And you end up with this rationing system. I saw the rationing system there in Cuba where people were lined up to get these great big vats like beans, and they'd ladle them out as to their allotment. Uh, I mean, it's so mind-boggling that people still go for this thing, and not only that, but think about all the grocery store owners that are just barely making it. From what I understand, grocery stores operate in a very thin margin, on a profit margin. So the government comes in and starts undercutting them and puts them out of business. And now you've caused unemployment among people that had legitimate jobs, legitimate employment. And the other thing to think about it too is the macro thing is that, the reason that people are having a hard time making ends meet, theoretically, it could be supply and demand in New York, that more people moving into New York, prices start going up. That's the law of supply and demand. But My hunch is much more the fact that the government is taking so much of people's income, both with direct taxation, like income taxation, FICA taxes, New York income taxes, but also the Federal Reserve through the debasement of the dollar. Look how much value people have lost in terms of their purchasing power. But people don't look at it like that. They just say, "Oh, I can't afford this. Here's a quick, easy way for to abolish poverty. Have the government start running this place or that place." And I mean, gosh, look at the examples. Amtrak. I mean, how much the government does the government still have to underwrite Amtrak? Or look at the Postal Service. I mean, why is it, Richard, that people haven't learned this lesson that socialism is a catastrophic philosophy?
Because the appeal of a free lunch seems to be never ending. That's what people think this is. I'm going to be giving something for nothing, and they never think who's going to pay for it, how is it going to be delivered, what are the unintended and secondary and third effects that will occur. Because your point is an important complement to anything I was saying about by setting these below market prices, other smaller grocery stores that can't absorb this, like a big chain, the mom and pop grocery store, the image of that in low income communities, are going to be driven out of business. By the way, that's what undermined private charitable organizations when and private insurance activities in Great Britain in the early 20th century. Once government started supplying health care and retirement funding and other form of welfare state subsidized programs, these private sector alternatives, which were dependent upon voluntary contribution, could not survive. How do you compete against free, even when you're a charity? So as a consequence, it just undermined those other parts of the private sector. So in fact, you would exacerbate the grocery problem in the very low income neighborhoods that you're expressing a concern about. And if I can sort of then sort of segue into the next related theme that he has proposed, and that's pervasive rent controls throughout New York City. Rent controls have been disastrous historically, including in New York. Now, rent controls were introduced throughout the United States, including New York City, upon shortly after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in January of 1942. The city of New York said that, there's going to be a huge influx of military personnel and civilians working for the US government because of armaments and troop movements to Europe to support the Allied cause, against Hitler in Europe, eventually leading to the Normandy invasion, D-Day. And it would be price gouging. It would be unfair that during a time of a national crisis, that private apartment and homeowners who might rent their units out would earn wartime gouging prices at the cost and the expense of others who were just doing their bit for America. So price controls are introduced as a wartime emergency. In certain parts of New York City today, those wartime rent control emergency settings are still present. Now, what's been the consequence? Now, it's been a while since I've been in New York, but you could drive north out of New York, out of Manhattan on I-95, the Major Deegan Expressway, and you would skirt the Bronx, right? The borough north of Manhattan. And you could look off the highway and you would see derelict high-rise apartment buildings. And some of them, like a dollhouse, like one side is missing so you can like look into the apartments like a dollhouse. Derelict, and people are living in them. Why did they turn derelict? Because the fact is, the city of New York set the rent so low that the owners could not afford to do maintenance and repair. And if you're loss making in owning an apartment building, who's ever going to want to buy it from you? So the owners, the landlords, they would just walk away. So the housing deteriorated. The quality of the housing fell down. There were fewer incentives to build new housing for low income people in these communities. So many of the conditions that these people have lived in the past and in some of these neighborhoods still are due to the very rent controls that he wants to obviously extend more pervasively throughout the city. This is a disaster because when you set the rents too low, you create a greater demand, but you also reduce the incentive to supply. And therefore, the gap of the shortage will increase. And if there's no incentive to maintain or improve the housing, the supply will deteriorate over time. So the gap between the people wanting to live in those rent controlled apartments and those and the availability of it will be reduced. I'll make one other example of this. Bribery and corruption. I've been living in California and I earned my undergraduate degree in economics at California State University, Sacramento. And I received a scholarship to participate in the graduate Austrian economics program at New York University, which I participated in for a while. And so I've moved to New York. Now, I'm just a poor graduate student. I can't afford anything. So I'm looking for a place to live. And I want something that's a decent community and isn't going to cost me a fortune. So I'm looking, I started looking over in Queens, the New York borough, just east of Manhattan, east of the East River. And I'm looking, there's the overhead subways. It's convenient to get into Manhattan to do the classes. And I see this multi-story apartment building, and not a new building. And it had this metal plaque on the side that said apartments to let. So I go in and the owner doesn't live there. He has a manager of the apartment building. And in New York, they're called the superintendent, the super. And so I knock on his door and I say, I saw the to let sign. I'm interested in an apartment. Oh, that sign is up there anyway. There's no apartments available. But I can put your name on the waiting list. Great. How long do you think I'll have to wait till something opens up? You probably will be able to move into one of our apartments in about 5 years. But I'm hoping I'm out of graduate school in 5 years. What do you mean 5 years? So I'm going to live on the street till I can afford the apartment that I no longer need. So to make a long story short, I moved into the apartment the following week. Why? It's called taking cash in an envelope. And what is the phrase? Under the table. Now, the owner doesn't care. He just wants his apartments rented out. And it was a rent controlled building. And the superintendent is in charge of the plumbing, the heating, people aren't doing too much graffiti, and to keep the apartments rented. So what would happen is that then it falls upon the superintendent, the guy managing the apartment building, to determine who's going to be first for the next available apartment. Well, he's following the price mechanism. Who's the highest bidder through a bribe? And I was fortunate enough. Now, this meant that I hardly ate for the next 6 or 7 weeks. Okay. A quarter, I'm starving. Oh, but I made him a bribe and I got in. And it was a well-maintained apartment. So again, I moved in, it was filthy. So you're cleaning up, you're scrubbing, so now I finished, cleaning up the kitchen, the living room. It was like a one bedroom, one little living room and a small kitchen apartment. And so now I'm sweaty, I'm dirty. I get into the shower and I pull the curtain shut and a wall of cockroaches fall on me from the. Oh, God. Only in America. Anyway, but this shows, yeah, obviously they didn't spend the money on pest control, right? So then I had to, I had to get traps out and bug spray. Oh, it was awful. But now, while I've tried to tell this story with a little bit of humor, this becomes the reality in government rent-controlled apartments. And it becomes even worse if the government just doesn't control rent, but takes over the apartment buildings itself and manages them. And the cases of that being a disaster is, in fact, public housing in New York City. They're derelict high-rise apartments with graffiti, people urinating and defecating in the hallways, the lights not being replaced in the hallway so it's dark to get to your apartment, assuming you can go up rather than walking through the elevator if it's working. This is the reality when government owns and manages things. No irrationality, no profit motive to maintain it, no efficiency, and the danger of not just corruption and bribery, but crime, because nobody's there to care.
Yeah. Well, as I'm listening to you, I'm sitting here thinking it's the same phenomenon where people have lost or never gained any faith in the free market process. I mean, what
Yes.
you're really talking about is the opposite system is the ideal where landowners can charge whatever they want. Oh, that sounds horrible. They can charge $1 million. Yeah, they can charge whatever they want. It's their private property. That's what we call the private property order. And then the consumers decide whether they want to rent and pay that price. That's your market. It's based on supply and demand. But Richard, there is absolutely no faith among so many Americans in that process. I mean, they see this promise that I'm going to make life better for you by keeping your rents cheap. And it's like, oh, wow, there's your siren song again. Wow, this is fantastic. I mean, what an easy way, Richard, to just run a society. Just have the government establish rent controls all across America. Now everybody can afford the rents. But as you point out, there's a huge cost in that. Private owners now are not coming onto the market, which they would if rents were soaring. More people would have the incentive to convert other facilities into apartments, saying, "Well, I want part of this money," and then all of a sudden the rents start coming down. Laws of supply and demand. People would take care of their property because they get better tenants and so forth. And you look around, you look at any area that has a free market pricing system, everything's in better condition. You don't find the cockroaches and so forth. It's only in New York City where you've had these rent control facilities for decades and decades, and yet people continue to just be sucked in with this thing. And again, I turn to Cuba again. That okay, it starts out with a rent control, but as you point out, it inevitably morphs into government ownership. So now the government's not just running the grocery stores and the pharmacies and the restaurants. Now the government's running the housing market, buying the
Yes.
houses. And that's the way it was in Cuba. The government owns everything. And look what happens. Everybody's poor and everything's dilapidated.
A fundamental philosophical problem that works through all of this is the belief that people who act in their own self-interest necessarily are acting in ways that greedily harm others. The idea that in the marketplace, going back to Adam Smith, when men participate in a system of division of labor and specialize in one or a handful of things, but acquire everything else they need from others in the local community or extended to the world, then each in that division of labor has to ask himself, in my own self-interest, in my own self-interest, what is it that I must specialize in, the product to produce, the service to provide, that others would take in trade from me sufficiently that I could acquire from them all the things that I desire. And reciprocally, other individuals in society are doing the same. So the benefit of the free market, where there is voluntary association, freedom of exchange, and mutually agreed transactions all across the board, each one in their own individual pursuit of their self-interest, has to say, what is it that I can do for others to advance my own good? In other words, the market harnesses, quote, selfishness for the individual to enhance himself, but through the market mechanism to improve the conditions of all. It is the only system that does this. Everybody is guided by self-interest. Vladimir
Uh,
Putin is guided by self-interest. Xi Jinping is guided by self-interest. Hitler and Stalin were guided by self-interest. All of the people in the bureaucracies and in the ministries and the departments and the bureaus are guided by self-interest. The problem there is that there is no mechanism that makes the individual be restrained by the rules of the game to only pursue his interests in ways that do no harm to others, that don't make others sacrifices for him to improve. Because in the marketplace, there is no mutual sacrifice. There's only mutual gains from trade. Now, that is a theme that was, of course, the heart of Ayn Rand's novels, The Fountainhead, especially Atlas Shrugged, that there is nothing wrong with the individual having the right to live his own life, his right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that the rules of the game require you just to respect the equivalent rights in others and to associate on the basis of free association and voluntary agreement. And once you do that, self-interest has been harnessed to use a much abused word, but can have a proper meaning, the common good. But these people have lost any appreciation or even understanding of this.
All right. Well, in the waning moments of the program, then let's go to his basic philosophical point of taking from the rich and giving to the poor. I mean, that's, or maybe just taking from the rich. You know, these socialists, they want equality. They don't like millionaires. They don't like billionaires. So even if the money just got burned up, let's say you take it from all the New York City millionaires and you burn the money up, they'd be happy with that. It doesn't have to necessarily go to the poor. Now they use the poor as their justification. Um, but you've got this mindset, and it doesn't just exist within Mamdani. It's really across the board. That's what justifies the whole welfare state way of life that Roosevelt forced it on the American people. Now, let me go back to the period that I like the late 1800s, where Americans said, no, freedom entails keeping everything you earn. No income tax, no IRS. That's why there was no income tax for more than 100 years. And no welfare state, no Social Security, no Medicare, Medicaid, welfare, food stamps, anything like that. And they said people have a right to decide for themselves what to do with their own money. And the result was tremendous inequalities. You had John D. Rockefeller, the so called robber barons, as multimillionaires. But everybody benefited. Those at the bottom of the economic ladder were significantly better off than their counterparts in Europe and Asia and Latin America and Africa because a free market system was benefiting everybody. They had figured out how to create a wealthy, prosperous society for everyone, even though there was massive inequalities of wealth. It didn't matter. Uh, but when you get this idea that it's wrong for some to have more than others, which really is enshrining the great sin of covetousness into the political system, that's what's going on here. They really resent that some people are millionaires when they're not. We got to take from them. We got to bring them down to our level. What ends up happening is what you have in Cuba, what you had in the Soviet Union, where you've wiped out the millionaires, but now you've wiped out the cow that's producing the milk. And so now everybody's equal, but everybody's equally poor. They're desperately poor. But from the mind of the socialist, I think that's okay with him. That the socialist would rather have everybody equal in terms of poverty than to have everybody unequal in a free market system, even though the poor are significantly better off and living relatively nice lives. What do you
Yeah,
think?
this is this envy, which is usually has been historically considered a great sin, um, is exacerbated and complemented by the Marxian conception that if some are rich, it is only due to the fact that they have taken advantage and exploited others. That's the class warfare. The property owners extract part of the wealth that the real workers have produced and gain for themselves what they have not provided any labor to manufacture. They have stolen from the workers. Therefore, it's a zero-sum game. If they're wealthy people, they must have gotten their wealth at the expense of others, the poor in the society. And all we're doing is expropriating the expropriators. This is an important thing. And I should mention that this self-proclaimed democratic socialist who seemingly will be the Democratic Party nominee for the mayorship of New York City. I was reading just recently that just 2 years ago, I think it was 2023, he was giving a talk before the Young Socialists of America or some group like that. And he was giving the list of what they stand for. And he said, and our ultimate goal is the seizure of the means of production. But it's just that too many of our fellow Americans are not quite ready enough for that. So, but the Marxian ethos, class conflict, the rich steal from and exploit the poor. This is the conceptual, theoretical, ideological mindset that reinforces and justifies the baser and much older human psychosis of envy.
All right. Well, let's wrap it up with one final point that you've already raised, but I think it's worth emphasizing. And that is that people start to vote with their feet when this goes on. It's Atlas Shrugged. You mentioned Atlas Shrugged, where the producers go on strike and say we're not going to put up with this anymore. And when these millionaires are leaving New York to go to Texas or Florida or some other place where they're not plundering them to the same extent, they're essentially saying we're not going to let you do this to us anymore. And so then they have to figure out a way to put an exit tax on them, punish them for daring to leave, because this mindset is you need to stay here and produce so that we can plunder and loot you, and until such a point where they break the backs of the producers, and you end up with this totally impoverished society.
I'll just mention before we end one other thing. Uh, in such socialist systems of supposed equality of the masses, as George Orwell said, some are equal. Oh, we're all equal, but some are more equal than others, right? The ruling elite, the apparatchiks, the party members. There was a joke in the old Soviet Union that the then Communist Party head, Leonid Brezhnev, was showing his mother one of the palatial, party palaces that he lived in. Okay, and his mother says to Leonid Brezhnev, Leonid, Leonid, I'm so good that you have made such a success of your life. But what happens when the communists find out?
Yeah, it goes to the heart of the hypocrisy of this whole system.
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
yeah, the people that in power are usually the only wealthy people left.
I don't think that during his lifetime in ruling Cuba, that Fidel Castro ever had to worry about a lack of food due to any U.S. sanctions.
Right.
And the same
Uh,
thing is that whatever lack of Western goods are hitting Russians today, I don't think it's affecting Vladimir Putin's dietary choices.
right. Well, to wrap things up, the ideal from a libertarian standpoint for the people of New York is abolish all rent controls, get rid of all the income taxes in the city, and whatever other taxes they have there for that matter, and free up the market. And then you're talking about and privatize. Now you're talking about a real dynamic, prospering city, especially for those at the bottom of the economic ladder.
Absolutely, 100%.
All right. On that note, we'll wrap things up. Thank you all for tuning in. Thanks again for your support of FFF. Richard, as always, I greatly enjoyed the visit. Talk to you next week.
Until next time.